They came around the last bend, still wearing their wedding clothes, still tasting the kiss that had made them husband and wife just hours before. The house was on fire. Everything she had built, the curtains she had sewn, the kitchen table where she had taught him to read, the wildflowers in the jar, all of it burning. And there at the edge of the property, a figure sat on horseback, watching. The man who had killed her father 15 years ago had just burned her home on her wedding night. But Clara Dawson was done being afraid. This is how it all began. The horse had not trusted a living soul in 4 years. Garrett Dawson knew this the way he knew the weight of winter in Montana, the way he knew the silence of a mountain before a storm breaks. He had pulled that stallion from a canyon and with his own bloodied hands had nursed the animal back from the edge of death through weeks of fever and thrashing. He had named him Thunder because of the way the stallion's hooves had struck the canyon walls when he found him desperate and half wild, a sound like God dragging furniture across the sky. And in all that time, through all those years of shared solitude on this mountain, Thunder had never once allowed another human being to lay a finger on him. Until her. The late afternoon sun stretched long and gold across the Montana Valley, painting the barn door in amber light and throwing the shadow of the mountain across the south pasture like a dark hand reaching. Garrett stood just inside the barn, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe, his weathered hat pulled low over eyes the color of creek water in winter. He had heard Thunder's distress from the north fence line, a sharp and panicked whinnying that carried across the ridgeline and brought him running back at a full sprint. The stallion had torn his shoulder open on the barbed wire again, the gash deep in ugly blood matting his midnight coat into dark ribbons. But when Garrett reached the barn, he did not find his horse alone. A girl knelt in the dust beside Thunder. Her dress was calico, faded from washing. And patched at the elbows, and it pooled around her in the dirt like a wilted flower. Her boots were worn through at the soles. She had no horse, no wagon, no companion. She had simply appeared on his land like something the wind had carried in and set down gently. And she was whispering to his horse. Her hand hovered just above Thunder's trembling flank, not quite touching, as if she understood that the animal needed to come to her. Her voice was so soft that Garrett could barely make out the words from where he stood, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the voice of someone who had known suffering and recognized it in another living thing. Thunder's ears swiveled toward her. The stallion's breathing, which had been ragged and sharp with pain, began to slow. The white rim of panic in his dark eyes softened, and then in a movement so gentle it seemed impossible from an animal of his size and fear, Thunder lowered his great head and pressed his velvet nose into the palm of her outstretched hand. Garrett Dawson had survived 2 years of the bloodiest war his country had ever known. He had buried friends in shallow graves and walked through fields where the dead outnumbered the living. He had carved a life from raw mountain stone with nothing but his own 2 hands and a stubborn refusal to die. Very little in this world could surprise him anymore. But this stopped him cold. He stepped out of the shadow and into the light, and his voice came rough the way it always did when he was caught off guard. "Step back from that horse. He's dangerous." The girl's head snapped up. Her eyes found his, and Garrett felt something shift behind his ribs, a sensation like a locked door being tested. She had eyes the color of warm earth after rain, large and steady, and there was no fear in them. Not of Thunder, not of him. And Garrett Dawson was not a man that people looked at without at least a flicker of unease. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that had been built by years of felling timber and hauling stone. His beard was dark and full, his hair long enough to tie back with a leather cord. A scar bisected his left eyebrow, pale against his sun-darkened skin, a memento from a fight he had won years ago, in defense of a woman he had never seen again. He looked like what he was, a man who had left civilization behind and made himself part of the mountain. But this girl looked at him the way she looked at the horse, with understanding, not fear. "He is hurt," she said, simply turning back to Thunder. "He needs help. He needs a bullet." The words came out harder than Garrett intended, but he had seen too many animals go wild with pain and take someone with them. Horse like that gone mad with hurting is a danger to everyone nearby. Already tried to kick through the barn door twice today. "He is scared." Her voice stayed low, soothing, still focused entirely on the stallion. Whoever hurt him taught him that people mean pain. He just needs someone to show him different. She began to hum, a low melody, something old and gentle, the kind of tune that grandmothers hummed over cradles and women sang to themselves while kneading bread in kitchens that smelled of flour and wood smoke. Thunder's ear twitched toward the sound. His breathing eased further. His great muscles, corded, intense beneath his dark coat, began to unclench. Garrett opened his mouth to warn her again, to tell her she was going to lose a hand or worse, but the words died on his tongue. Because Thunder was leaning into her touch, now his nose still resting in her palm, his eyes half closed. The stallion looked more peaceful than Garrett had seen him in months. "I will be damned," Garrett breathed. The girl glanced up at him, and in the golden light of that Montana afternoon with dust motes drifting around her like tiny stars, she almost looked like something from a painting. She was younger than he had first thought. Very young, early 20s at most, with delicate features that the hard country had not yet managed to harden entirely. But her hands were not soft. Her hands were the hands of someone who had worked every day of her life. "My horse has never trusted anyone," Garrett said, and the wonder in his own voice unsettled him. "Not since I found him half dead in a canyon 4 years back. Will not let a soul touch him but me, and even then he is cautious about it." "Animals know," the girl said quietly, her fingers now stroking Thunder's neck with slow, sure movements. The powerful muscles beneath his coat shivered and relaxed under her touch. "They know who means them harm, and they know who does not." Garrett found himself crouching beside her before he fully decided to move. His body simply did it, drawn by some instinct he did not have a name for. This close, he could see the shadows under her eyes, the way her collarbones pressed against the thin fabric of her dress. She had not eaten well in a long time. He could also smell her faintly, soap and wildflowers and trail dust, and something about that combination made his pulse do something unexpected. He pushed the thought away the moment it arrived. "Name is Garrett Dawson," he said. "This is my land. Saw someone walking up the mountain road about an hour ago. Was coming to investigate when I heard Thunder carrying on." Clara Whitfield. She kept her focus on the horse. Easier perhaps than meeting his eyes at this distance. "I was told in town there might be work up here. Cooking, cleaning, mending, whatever needs doing." Garrett studied her in silence. The mountain road from Elkhorn was nearly 10 miles of switchbacks and loose stone climbing through pine forest and along ridge lines where the wind could knock a grown man sideways. He had ridden it hundreds of times and never once considered it pleasant. "You walk 10 miles up a mountain in this heat to ask for work." Clara Whitfield lifted her chin. It was a small gesture, but it transformed her entirely, turning the thin and weary girl into something sharper, something with edges. "I walked because I do not have a horse, and I need the work because I do not have anything else, Mr. Dawson. No family, no home, and as of 3 days ago, no room at the boarding house because I could not make rent." Something moved through Garrett's chest, not pity. He had no use for pity, and he suspected she had even less. It was recognition. The understanding that passed between people who had been stripped down to nothing and had to rebuild themselves from the raw materials of their own stubbornness. He looked at Thunder's shoulder. The gash was deep, still seeping blood through the drying crust. It would need cleaning, probably stitching. Work that required steady hands and the kind of patience that his own rough temperament did not possess. "Thunder's shoulder needs proper tending," he said gruffly. "Cleaning and stitching both. Seeing as he has taken to you in a way that defies every piece of sense I have left. Do you think you could help with that?" "I can try." "Then consider it your first day of work." He stood and offered her his hand. Clara hesitated, just for a heartbeat. Her eyes dropped to his hand, large enough to engulf both of hers, calloused and scarred, then back to his face. Then she took it. Easily as lifting a sack of flour, and for a moment they stood there, her hand in his, the space between them charged with something neither of them was ready to name. "You are smaller than I expected," he said. The words came out before he could think better of them. "When Dutch told me someone from town was asking about work up here, I pictured someone older." Clara pulled her hand back. Garrett noticed that she flexed her fingers as if the feeling of his skin against hers had left an impression she was trying to shake loose. "I am 22, Mr. Dawson, and I have been taking care of myself since I was 7 years old. That makes a woman plenty capable." "Garrett," and I meant no disrespect, "just means I will have to adjust my thinking about what kind of work might suit. I am stronger than I look. I have no doubt about that." He moved toward the steps, and Thunder, in what Garrett could only describe as a miracle, followed without a lead rope. The stallion walked between them, Garrett on one side and Clara on the other, and stayed calm, as if the presence of both of them together created something that neither of them could provide alone. They worked in the barn as the light shifted from gold to copper. Garrett gathered water and clean cloths while Clara continued her soft murmuring to Thunder, keeping the stallion steady, with her voice and touch. When the time came to clean the wound, Garrett positioned himself at the horse's head, one large hand flat against Thunder's neck. "Never thought I would take direction from someone who barely reaches my shoulder," he muttered. "I am not giving direction," Clara replied, her hands moving with quiet precision over the torn flesh. "I am just saying what needs doing." Thunder flinched when she touched the wound, a sharp whinny of pain that echoed through the barn. But Garrett's voice rumbled through the space, low and steady, the way the earth itself might sound if it could speak. "Easy, boy. She is helping you. I know it hurts, but she is helping." Clara worked quickly, cleaning away dirt and dry blood. Her brow furrowed with concentration. The gash was deep, but clean, no infection yet, and when she looked up at Garrett, her expression was matter of fact. "It needs stitching. I have done this before. My grandmother taught me on the horses she kept." "Your grandmother sounds like a woman worth knowing." "She was. She raised me after my parents died, taught me everything." Clara paused and something flickered across her face, grief that was old but still sharp enough to cut. "She told me once that the measure of a person is how they treat those who cannot fight back." Garrett looked at his stallion, at the gentle way this stranger girl handled the animal that trusted no one. "Then what does Thunder's trust tell you about me?" Clara met his eyes over the horse's back. "That you are a better man than you probably give yourself credit for." The air in the barn changed. It thickened, warmed, hummed with something electric and unnamed. Garrett's hand rose from the horse's neck, almost reaching toward her, and then dropped back to his side. He cleared his throat. "There is a cabin out behind the main house. Used to belong to my foreman before he retired. It is small, but it is clean and sturdy. Good lock on the door. If you want the world, it is yours." He heard the words beneath his own words, and hoped she heard them too. "You will be safe here, on my mountain, under my watch. No one will harm you." "I want it," Clara said. "Good." Garrett nodded, turning his hat in his hands. "That is good." They finished the stitching together, Thunder holding remarkably still between Garrett's soothing voice and Clara's gentle hands. When the last stitch was tied, they both exhaled at the same moment, and the shared breath felt oddly intimate in the quiet of the barn. Garrett showed her to the cabin as the last light drained from the sky. It was small, yes, but built with the same careful craftsmanship as everything else on the property. Stone fireplace, a sturdy bed with a good mattress, a table and two chairs, a window that looked out over the valley below. Someone had already laid wood for a fire and left fresh linens folded on the bed. Clara realized it was Garrett. He had been preparing for whoever came to work here, and he had made sure the space was welcoming. "It is not much," he said from the doorway, as if uncertain whether he should cross the threshold. "It is more than I had this morning." Clara ran her hand across the quilt on the bed. Clean, warm, hers. "Thank you, Mr. Dawson." "Garrett?" "Thank you, Garrett." He stood in the doorway a moment longer, hat in his hands, and in the fading purple light of the Montana evening, the mountain man who had built this ranch with his bare hands and lived in self-imposed exile for 5 years looked almost uncertain. Almost vulnerable. "Breakfast is at dawn," he said. "I will show you the kitchen and introduce you to my 3 hands, Dutch Samuel and Henry. They are good men, rough but decent. If any of them gives you trouble, you come to me. I can handle myself." "I am beginning to believe that." He moved toward the steps, then stopped without turning around. "Clara." Her name in his rough voice did something to the air in the room, changed the temperature of it. "Yes, I'm glad you came here today. Cannot say exactly why, but I am." Then he was gone, his boots heavy on the wooden steps, his broad frame disappearing into the mountain darkness, like a shadow returning to its source. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands to her chest where her heart was doing things she had never felt before. She was 22 years old and had never been kissed, never been courted, never even been looked at the way Garrett Dawson had looked at her when Thunder nuzzled her hand, like she was something impossible, something miraculous. She told herself it was nothing. Gratitude surprised the natural response of a man seeing his beloved horse trust a stranger. But when she closed her eyes, all she could see were those gray-blue eyes, bright as creek water, watching her with an intensity that felt like standing too close to a fire. She had come here for a job. She had not come here for this. But maybe, Clara thought as she lay down in a real bed for the first time in weeks and listened to the mountain wind singing through the pines. Maybe some things found you whether you were looking for them or not. Morning came to the mountain in a wash of silver and gold, and Clara woke before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. She had always been an early riser trained by her grandmother, who believed that the best work was done before the world had time to get in the way. She dressed in her second dress, the only other one she owned, and made her way to the main house in the cold, thin air. The ranch was larger than she had realized in yesterday's fading light. A sprawling operation carved from the mountainside itself with corrals and outbuildings and a timber-framed main house that sat at the edge of a clearing overlooking the valley below. Everything was solid, well-built, maintained with obvious pride. But there was a barrenness to it. No curtains in the windows, no flowers by the door, no sign that anyone had ever tried to make this place anything more than functional. The kitchen was large, well-stocked, and organized the way a man organizes things, which is to say, barely organized at all. Clara found flour and lard and eggs, found a side of bacon in the coal box, found coffee beans and a good grinder. She set to work, and the familiar rhythm of cooking steadied her nerves in a way that nothing else could. Kneading dough, cracking eggs, the sizzle of bacon in the iron skillet. These were the sounds of her childhood, her grandmother's kitchen, the only place she had ever felt entirely at home. She was pulling biscuits from the oven when Garrett walked in. He stopped in the doorway, simply stopped as if he had walked into a wall. His eyes moved from the golden biscuits to the pan of sausage gravy, to the fried eggs glistening on a plate, to the pot of coffee so strong and dark it was nearly black. Then his eyes moved to Clara standing at the stove with flour on her cheek and morning light in her hair, and something in his expression cracked open. "No one has cooked a meal like this in this house since my mother passed 10 years ago." The words came out rough, stripped of his usual gruffness, and Clara felt them land in her chest like a physical thing. "Sit down," she said gently. "Eat while it is hot. I made enough for everyone." Garrett lowered himself into a kitchen chair, and the wooden frame seemed suddenly too small for his mountain of a body. Clara poured him coffee and tried to ignore the way his eyes followed her as she moved. When he took the first bite of biscuit, he closed his eyes, and the expression on his face was something close to reverence. "Lord have mercy," he said quietly. Warmth bloomed in Clara's chest. When was the last time anyone had appreciated something she had done? She had been a hired hand, a charity case, a mouth to feed. She had never been someone whose work made another person close their eyes with gratitude. The three ranch hands arrived shortly after. Dutch Callahan was the eldest, a weathered man in his late 40s with a quick grin and a talent for finding humor in everything. Samuel Briggs was quieter, observant, the kind of man who noticed things others missed. Henry Ward was the youngest, at barely 25, enthusiastic and eager to please. They filed in and stopped dead at the sight of the table. "Boss did not mention the new cook was a lady," Dutch said, his face splitting into a wide smile. "And a pretty one at that." "Dutch." One word from Garrett, but the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. The warning in his voice was unmistakable. "Just being friendly, boss." But Dutch sat down fast and kept his eyes on his plate. Clara noticed how Garrett's jaw tightened, the way his body shifted subtly between her and the men. A protective instinct, immediate and fierce. It should have irritated her. She had been protecting herself her whole life and needed no one to do it for her, but instead, it made her feel something she had not felt since her grandmother was alive. Safe. After breakfast, Garrett showed her the ranch properly. The chicken coop needed tending. The vegetable garden had gone to weeds. The house itself needed attention in every room. Dust and disorder accumulated by men who worked from dawn to dark and had no time or inclination for domesticity. "I know it is a lot," Garrett said almost apologetically. "I can handle more than you think." "I know you can, but take it slow. Meals and Thunder's wound are the priority." They fell into an easy rhythm, tending the stallion together, Clara cleaning and rebandaging, while Garrett kept the horse calm. Their hands brushed as they worked once, twice, 3 times, and each accidental touch sent a jolt up Clara's arm that she could not explain and could not ignore. "You are good with him," Garrett said, watching her secure the bandage. "Natural. My grandmother kept horses. She taught me they are like people. They remember kindness and cruelty in equal measure. Smart woman. She was the smartest person I ever knew." Clara finished the bandage and looked up. "She told me once that you can know everything about a man by watching how he treats an animal that cannot repay him. Kindness given without expectation of return is the truest form of it." Garrett's eyes met hers, and the air between them went thick again, charged with that same unnamed electricity. His hand came up, his rough fingers almost brushing her cheek, and then he pulled back as if he had touched something hot. "I should get to work," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Fences need mending on the north pasture." Clara nodded, not trusting her own voice. The days found their shape. Clara rose before dawn and cooked. She cleaned and mended. She tended the garden, coaxed the chickens into producing again, hung curtains. She sewed from spare fabric, placed wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen table. Slowly, steadily, she transformed the house from a shelter into something that felt like a home. But it was the evenings that undid her. The ranch hands ate in their bunkhouse, leaving Clara and Garrett alone in the kitchen. He would come in from the range as the sun dropped behind the mountains covered in dust and smelling of pine and leather and honest labor. He would wash at the pump while Clara set the table, and then they would sit across from each other and talk. They talked about everything. His childhood in Texas, a ranch that had been in his family for generations, until his father lost it to debt and drink. Her years with her grandmother, the tiny cabin at the edge of Elkhorn, where she had learned to cook and sew and shoot and love horses. His time in the war spoken of, in fragments and shadows, the parts he could bear to share. Her love of books, the battered volumes she carried with her, like talismans, the only possessions she had refused to sell, even when she was hungry. She learned that he had fought in the war at 18 and come home at 20, unable to sleep in a room with walls. That the nightmare still came sometimes, and that on those nights he would walk the perimeter of his property in the dark, checking fence lines and counting horses, because moving was the only thing that kept the memories from swallowing him whole. That he had climbed this mountain looking for silence and built everything on it with his own hands, every beam and post and stone laid with the desperate precision of a man trying to construct something permanent in a world that had shown him how easily everything could be destroyed. She learned about Ruth. He spoke of his former wife, the way one speaks of a storm that has passed but left damage. She had come to the mountain full of romantic notions about frontier life, about handsome cowboys and breathtaking sunsets and the adventure of it all. But the reality was isolation. Months of snow. Days when the only voice you heard was your own. Ruth had lasted one winter and part of a spring before she packed a bag, left a note on the kitchen table, and rode down the mountain on a horse she had borrowed from Dutch. The note had said, "You are too hard to love, too closed off, too much work and not enough of anything else. I cannot make a home with a man who would rather talk to his horse than to his wife." Garrett had read that note with Dutch's help because he could not read well enough to make out the words on his own, and that detail Clara realized had added humiliation to heartbreak. He had needed another man to read the letter in which his wife explained why she was leaving him. He had kept the note. Clara did not know this yet, but she would learn it eventually, and when she did, it would break her heart in a way she did not expect. He learned that she had never known a father. Not really. That her mother had died of illness when Clara was 7, grief-stricken and broken, and that her grandmother had raised her to be strong and self-sufficient because the world, her grandmother said, was not kind to women who depended on others for their survival. He learned that she had never been courted, never been kissed, never been held by anyone who was not family. Not because she was afraid, but because she had never trusted anyone enough to let them close. And then came the night that changed everything. "I cannot read much." Garrett admitted, his voice rough with something that sounded like shame. He stared at the table rather than meet her eyes. "Just enough to sign my name and make out simple words. My father was not the teaching kind, and the war came before school had a chance to stick." Clara watched his jaw tighten, watched the way his hands curled into fists on the table, as if confessing this weakness cost him more than any wound. "I could teach you," she said softly, "if you wanted." His eyes came up to hers, gray-blue, and startled with something vulnerable flickering in their depths. "You would do that?" "I would like to." So the evening shifted. After dinner, Clara brought out her grandmother's books, worn and soft with use, and sat beside Garrett at the kitchen table. Their shoulders nearly touched. The warmth of his body radiated against her side like a wood stove, and she was aware of every inch of space between them and the diminishing of it. She started with simple things, the letters themselves, their sounds and shapes. Garrett already knew most of them could pick them out individually, but stringing them into words had always been the place where his mind stumbled. Clara was patient. She had learned patience from her grandmother, who had taught her that anything worth doing was worth doing slowly, and she had learned it again from years of going hungry and waiting for better days that sometimes came and sometimes did not. Garrett held the book like it was something that might bite him. His enormous hands dwarfed the pages, and the sight of those scarred and calloused fingers tracing beneath the words, moving with painful care, made Clara's throat tight in a way she did not fully understand. This man had built a ranch from wilderness. He had survived a war. He could break a wild horse and fell a tree and pull a calf from its mother in a snowstorm. But sitting at a kitchen table with a book in his hands, he looked more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. He was a quick study, fiercely focused, his brow furrowed in concentration as he sounded out syllables. His rough voice stumbled over long words and lingered on short ones, and each time he conquered a difficult passage, the smile that broke across his weathered face was so bright and boyish that Clara's heart forgot its rhythm entirely. One evening, 2 weeks in, Garrett read an entire paragraph without stopping. It was a passage from one of Clara's grandmother's books, a story about a man who crossed mountains to find his way home. And when Garrett finished the last sentence, he looked up at Clara with an expression of such pure triumph and disbelief that she had to press her hand to her mouth to keep from crying. "I did that," he said, wonder in his voice. "I just read that whole thing." "You did. Read it straight through. Every word." He stared at the book, then at her, and his eyes were shining in the lamplight. "My whole life I thought there was something wrong with me. Something broken up here." He tapped his temple. "Thought maybe the war knocked something loose. But it was just that nobody ever sat down and showed me. There was never anything wrong with you, Garrett. You just needed someone patient enough to sit beside you." He looked at her for a long time after that, and the expression on his face was one that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. It was not gratitude, though gratitude was part of it. It was the look of a man who had spent years believing himself to be fundamentally flawed and was beginning to understand that he might have been wrong. To smooth the furrow from his brow, to smooth the furrow from his brow, to press her hand against his chest and feel the steady beat of the heart that lived beneath all that armor. She was 22 years old, and she had read about love in her grandmother's books, had imagined it as something distant and theoretical, a fine thing that happened to other women in other stories. She had never imagined it would feel like this, like standing at the edge of a cliff and wanting to jump, like being terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, like coming home to a place she had never been before. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of breakfasts and bandages, of reading lessons and quiet conversations, of hands brushing and eyes meeting, and neither of them saying what both of them knew was building between them like weather gathering over the mountain. One night, Garrett's hand covered hers on the table, large and warm and deliberate, not accidental, intentional. "Clara, I need to tell you that I—" A sharp knock on the door shattered the moment like a rock through glass. Henry stood on the porch, hat in hand, his young face tight with worry. "Boss, sorry to interrupt. We have a problem. South fence has been cut. Looks deliberate. 3 places at least." Garrett's expression transformed. The softness vanished, replaced by something hard and calculating, the face of a man who had survived war and knew what threats looked like. "I will be right there." He turned to Clara, and frustration was written across every line of his body. "I am sorry. This might take all night." "Be safe," she whispered. He nodded once, their eyes holding for a charged moment, and then he was gone into the dark. Clara stood alone in the kitchen, her hands still warm where his had covered it, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew what was happening between them, had known for days, perhaps from the very first moment when Thunder had pressed his nose into her palm and she had looked up to find those gray-blue eyes watching her with wonder. But knowing and accepting were two very different things. In a cabin on a mountain falling for a man, in a cabin on a mountain falling for a man who kissed his horse goodnight and could not read but wanted to learn, a man who looked at her like she was the first green thing to grow after a long, long winter. Sleep did not come. She lay in the dark and listened to the mountain, and when she heard horses returning past midnight, she went to the window and saw Garrett riding in with his men. All of them looked grim. The next morning, tension hung over breakfast like smoke. "Fence was cut in 3 separate places," Garrett told her quietly after the hands had left the kitchen. "Second time this month. Someone is trying to scatter my cattle, run me off my land. Do you know who? Up the mountain. Whoever controls this up the mountain, whoever controls this land controls the valley's water. He made me an offer last month that was more of a threat than a business proposition." Clara's hand froze on the dish she was washing. The plate nearly slipped from her fingers. She caught it, but something inside her went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What did you say?" "Hargrove, Earl Hargrove." The name landed in the kitchen like a stone thrown through a window. Clara set the plate down carefully because her hands had begun to tremble, and she did not want Garrett to see. But Garrett saw everything. He was beside her in 2 strides, his hand on her arm, his eyes searching her face. "You know that name?" It was not a question. Clara closed her eyes. Behind them, she saw a little girl of 7 standing at a graveside holding her grandmother's hand, watching a pine box disappear into Montana earth, while the autumn wind stripped the last leaves from the cottonwood trees. "My father's name was William Whitfield," she said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, thin and distant, as if it were coming from the little girl she had been and not the woman she had become. "He was a farmer outside Elkhorn. When I was very small, before I could understand things like debt and interest and ruin, he borrowed money from a man in town to buy land. Good land. Land with water on it, the kind of land that could support a family. The interest was impossible. Set up that way on purpose, I think designed so that no honest farmer could ever pay it back. When he could not meet the payments, the man took everything. The land, the equipment, the livestock, our home." She paused. The kitchen seemed very quiet, as if the house itself were holding its breath. "My father was a proud man. Not proud in the way of vanity, but proud in the way of a man who believed that if he worked hard enough and did right by people, the world would do right by him. Losing everything nearly killed him. But what came next did kill him." She opened her eyes and looked at Garrett, and in his gray-blue gaze she saw the understanding arriving, settling over his features like a shadow falling across a valley. "3 months after he lost everything, my father died. A horse and wagon accident on the Elkhorn Road. The horse was wild, untrained. It had been sold to him by the same man who took his land. Sold to him cheap, knowing full well that the animal had never been broken." The kitchen was very quiet. "The man's name," Clara whispered, "was Earl Hargrove." Garrett's hand tightened on her arm. "Not enough to hurt, enough to anchor." "Are you telling me that Hargrove killed your father?" "I am telling you that when I was 7 years old, a man sold my father a horse he knew was dangerous, and that horse killed him, and that man took everything we had, and my mother died of grief within the year, and I spent the rest of my childhood with no one in the world but a grandmother who loved me enough for all the people I had lost." She was not crying. She had cried out all her tears for William Whitfield long ago, but her body was shaking, a fine tremor that ran through her like wind through aspens. Garrett pulled her against his chest. It was not romantic. It was not tender in the way their almost moments had been. It was fierce and protective, the embrace of a man wrapping his body around something precious to shield it from harm. Clara pressed her face into his shirt and breathed in leather and pine and wood smoke, and for the first time in 15 years, she let someone else hold the weight of her grief. "He will not touch you," Garrett said, and his voice was something she had not heard before. Low, certain, dangerous in the way that a loaded rifle is dangerous when it is aimed and steady. "Not now, not ever, I swear it, Clara, on my life. He will never hurt you again." She believed him. That was the most terrifying part. She believed every word. That night, Clara stood on the porch of her cabin and looked out at the Montana sky, so thick with stars it seemed like the heavens were trying to bury the earth in light. She had come to this mountain looking for work, for survival, for one more day of not being hungry, not being homeless, not being invisible. Instead, she had found a horse who trusted her when he trusted no one. A mountain man who looked at her like she was the answer to a question he had stopped asking. And the ghost of her father's killer circling like a wolf at the edge of the firelight. The wind came down off the peak and moved through the pines, and it sounded like breathing, like the mountain itself was alive and watching. Clara was not afraid. She had been afraid for most of her life, and somewhere between Thunder's velvet nose in her palm and Garrett's arms around her in the kitchen, the fear had changed shape. It was still there, but it had transformed into something else, something fiercer, something with teeth of its own. Her grandmother had told her once on a night much like this one that courage was not the absence of fear. Courage was knowing what you stood to lose and choosing to stand anyway. Clara had thought she understood those words at the time. She had been 14, sitting by a fire much smaller than this sky, listening to an old woman whose hands were gnarled with arthritis but whose eyes were sharp as flint. Now standing on a porch on a mountain in Montana with the scent of pine smoke in her hair and the knowledge of an enemy circling in the dark, Clara understood her grandmother's words in a way she never had before. She was not just surviving anymore. She had something to protect. Someone to protect. And that changed everything. She was done running. She was done being small. Whatever was coming, whatever Hargrove had planned, whatever darkness lay ahead on this mountain, Clara Whitfield would face it, not alone, not anymore. In the barn below, thunder nickered softly into the dark. And somewhere in the main house, a light burned in the window, where Garrett Dawson sat awake watching over his mountain, his ranch, and the woman who had walked 10 miles uphill to change his life. Neither of them slept that night. Something to her hair that made his chest, something to her hair that made his chest hurt. She was humming that same low melody she had sung to Thunder the day she arrived, the one her grandmother had taught her, and she was kneading biscuit dough with the practiced rhythm of someone who had been doing this since childhood. Flour dusted her cheekbone. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and her forearms were pale and thin and stronger than they looked, the same way everything about her was stronger than it looked. Garrett stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, in the house he had built with his own hands on the mountain he had claimed as his refuge from the world, and he realized with a force that nearly buckled his knees that this house had never been a home. Not when he had built it, not when Ruth had tried and failed to live in it, not in all the years he had eaten alone at that table and slept alone in that bed and told himself that solitude was a choice and not a sentence. It had become a home the moment Clara Whitfield walked into it. She turned and saw him standing there, and whatever she saw in his face made her go still. The humming stopped. The dough sat forgotten under her flour-white hands. The morning light poured through the window and caught the dust motes in the air between them, turning them to gold. And in that suspended moment, Garrett thought that if he lived to be 100 years old, he would never see anything more beautiful than this woman in his kitchen, with flour on her face and sunrise in her hair. His hand came up, slowly, the way you move toward a wild thing you do not want to frighten. His fingers reached for her cheek, for that smudge of flour, for the warmth of her skin beneath it. He could feel the heat of her before he made contact, could see her breath catch, could see her eyes widen, not with fear, but with something that looked like the opposite of fear. His hand stopped, an inch from her face. His fingers trembled. He had not trembled in the war. He had not trembled when Ruth left. He had not trembled in any of the hard and violent years between then and now. But the thought of touching Clara Whitfield's cheek with his calloused and unworthy hand made Garrett Dawson shake like a boy. "I should get to work," he said, and his voice came out like gravel dragged over stone. He turned and walked out of the kitchen and into the cold morning air, and he did not stop walking until he reached the far fence line, where he leaned against a post and pressed his forehead to the rough wood and cursed himself for a coward. Behind him in the kitchen, Clara stood exactly where he had left her, her hands still buried in dough, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. The place on her cheek where his fingers had almost landed burned as though he had actually touched her. She raised her own hand and pressed it there, and the skin was hot, and she closed her eyes and let herself feel what she had been trying not to feel for weeks. She was in love with him. She was in love with the mountain man who had given her shelter and safety and purpose, who read haltingly by lamplight with his enormous hands cradling her grandmother's books like they were made of glass, who talked to his horse in the same low voice he used when he thought Clara was not listening, telling Thunder about the day's work, about the weather, about the woman in the kitchen who had turned his life inside out. She had heard him one evening standing outside the barn. She had not meant to eavesdrop, but his voice had carried on the still air. "She is something else, boy. Something I do not have a name for yet. Something that makes this mountain feel less like hiding and more like home." Clara had pressed her back against the cabin wall and put her hand over her mouth and felt tears slide down her cheeks, because no one in her entire life had ever spoken about her as though she were a gift rather than a burden. The moment of reckoning came on a Thursday afternoon in the barn, in the amber light that filtered through the gaps in the timber walls and painted everything the color of honey. Clara was brushing Thunder's coat. The stallion had healed beautifully, his shoulder scarred but strong, and he stood perfectly still under Clara's ministrations, his eyes half closed with contentment. He was a different animal than the one she had found that first day, wild-eyed and trembling. He was calm now, trusting. He leaned into her touch the way a child leans into its mother's hand. Garrett came into the barn and stopped. He watched her for a long moment, this small woman, with her gentle hands and her quiet voice and her way of making broken things whole again. Then he spoke, and his voice was rough with everything he had been carrying. "When Ruth left, she told me I was too hard to love, too closed off, not enough of anything that mattered." Clara's hand stilled on Thunder's flank. She did not turn around. She sensed with the instinct she had developed over a lifetime of reading the emotional weather of the people around her that Garrett needed to say this to her back, needed to speak the words without the weight of her eyes on him. "I believed her," he continued. Spent 5 years up on this mountain believing that she was right, that I was built wrong, broken by the war, or broken before, it did not matter which. I was not the kind of man that someone could love, and I was better off alone with my horse and my land and my silence. He paused. Clara heard him take a breath, the kind of breath a man takes before he steps off a cliff. But then you showed up, and everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I could feel, and what I was worth, all of it changed. You changed it, Clara. You made me feel things I did not know I could still feel. Made me want things I had given up on wanting. She turned then. She had to. His voice had cracked on the last word, a fracture in the stone of him, and she could not stand with her back to that kind of vulnerability. He was standing 3 feet away, his hat in his hands, his dark hair loose around his face. The scar through his eyebrow caught the light. His jaw was tight, the muscles working beneath his beard, and his eyes were gray-blue and shining with something that looked like it cost him everything to let her see. "What things?" Clara asked, and her own voice was barely more than a whisper. "A partner, a real marriage. Not just an arrangement like before. Someone to build a life with. Someone who would stay." His hands tightened on his hat knuckles, going white. "You, Clara. I want you. I have wanted you since the day my horse touched your hand, and I understood that there was a kind of goodness in this world I had forgotten existed." He stepped toward her. One step, then another. His hand came up again, the same hand that had trembled in the kitchen at dawn, and this time it did not stop. His rough fingers touched her cheek, and the sensation jolted through Clara's body like lightning finding ground. His thumb brushed the curve of her cheekbone calluses, whispering against skin, and she shivered from her scalp to the soles of her feet. Not from cold, not from fear. From the overwhelming, terrifying, magnificent reality that this was the first time in her 22 years of life that a man had touched her face as though she were something precious. "Clara, I know," she whispered. "I feel it too. You deserve better than me. Someone younger, softer, someone who does not carry as much darkness as I do." Clara looked straight into his eyes. "I do not need someone soft, Garrett. I need someone who makes me feel safe. And you are the only person in my entire life who has ever done that." He leaned down, slowly, giving her time to step back, to turn away, to change her mind. Every inch of his descent was a question, and every inch that Clara did not retreat was an answer. She rose on her toes to meet him. When their lips touched, the world outside the barn ceased to exist. There was no mountain, no ranch, no circling threat. There was only his mouth on hers, careful and questioning, and tender, in a way that seemed impossible from a man of his size and roughness. He kissed her like he was learning something new, like she was a language he wanted to speak fluently, but was terrified of mispronouncing. His hands cradled her face with such aching gentleness that Clara felt tears burning behind her closed eyelids. She had read about kisses in her grandmother's books. She had imagined them as a girl lying in the dark wondering what it would feel like. She had never imagined this completeness, this sense that the empty place in her that she had carried all her life was finally being filled. When they pulled apart, both of them breathing hard, Garrett pressed his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed. His hands had not left her face. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted, and his voice was wrecked, stripped bare. All the gravel and roughness burned away by something hotter. "I know." Clara's own voice shook. "Me too, but I have never... That was my first..." She could not finish the sentence. Her cheeks burned. Garrett pulled back far enough to look at her, and the expression on his face was one of such reverence that it made Clara's chest ache, as if she had given him something beyond measure, as if her inexperience was not a deficiency, but a treasure. "Then I will make sure every kiss after this one is worth the wait," he said softly. Clara smiled despite the tears on her lashes. That one was already worth 22 years of waiting. He pulled her against his chest, and she went willingly, pressing her ear to his heartbeat. It was fast, faster than she would have expected from a man who seemed so steady. He was as shaken as she was, and that knowledge made her braver. "This complicates things," she said against his shirt. "Yes. People will talk. You are my employer. I live on your land. Let them talk. I have been talked about before. It does not frighten me. It should not. You have nothing to be ashamed of." He rested his chin on top of her head, and she fit against him so perfectly, her small frame tucked into his large one, as though they had been designed as matching pieces of the same puzzle. But Clara, I need you to know that this is not just loneliness. It is not just two people so starved for warmth that they have mistaken proximity for something deeper. How do you know? Because I have been lonely for 5 years, and I have met other women in that time, and not a single one of them made my horse trust them, made my house feel like a home, or made me want to learn to read so I could be worthy of sitting next to them. Clara closed her eyes. I have been lonely my whole life, Garrett, and I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, not even close. They stood there in the barn wrapped in each other while Thunder watched them with dark, wise eyes, and the afternoon light turned slowly from gold to copper. But there was no time for the slow unfolding of new love. Not on this mountain, not with Earl Hargrove circling. It began 3 days after that first kiss. Clara was in the vegetable garden pulling weeds in the cool of the morning when Thunder began to scream. Not whinny, scream, a sound of raw distress that brought Clara to her feet and sent her running toward the barn with dirt still caked under her fingernails. Garrett came sprinting from the north pasture, his long legs eating the distance, and they arrived at the fence line at the same time. 3 horses stood at the edge of the property. Strangers. They had not been there at dawn. They were in terrible condition. Thin to the point of starvation, their ribs standing out like the bars of a cage beneath dull and matted coats. All 3 bore the marks of abuse. Whip scars across their hindquarters. Saddle sores rubbed raw and left untreated. One had a split hoof that had gone untended so long, the animal could barely stand. Clara's hands shook, not with fear, with fury. These are Hargrove's horses, Garrett said. His jaw was set so tight that the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. He works his animals half to death. Everyone in the valley knows it, and no one says a word because half of them owe him money and the other half are afraid of him. Why are they here on your land? Because he wants them here, probably turned them loose himself. He wants me to take them in so he can accuse me of stealing his property. It is a trap. Clara looked at the horses. The one with the split hoof had lowered herself to the ground, unable to stand any longer. Her dark eyes were dull with pain and exhaustion. But when Clara approached, slowly hands extended, the mare lifted her head and looked at her with something that was not quite hope, but was not yet the absence of it. I do not care if it is a trap, Clara said. We are not leaving them like this. They spent the rest of the day coaxing the frightened animals into the corral, cleaning wounds, offering food and water. Clara worked with a focus that bordered on ferocity, her small hands gentle on torn skin and swollen joints, her voice a constant low murmur of comfort. Thunder watched from his stall the entire time, alert and agitated, occasionally nickering in a way that sounded almost like encouragement. He knows they need help, Clara realized aloud. That is why he was screaming. He could see them from his stall. He knew they were suffering. Garrett looked at his stallion with an expression that was part wonder and part sorrow. He knew they were hurting. Somehow he knew. By sunset, the 3 horses were bedded down clean and fed and safe. Clara leaned against the fence, every muscle in her body aching, and Garrett stood beside her close enough that their arms touched. Neither of them moved away from the contact. How can people do this? Clara asked, and her voice cracked on the question. Same way they do it to each other. They think power gives them the right. Clara turned to face him. We have to stop him, Garrett, not just for the land or the water, for the horses, for everyone he has ever hurt. I know, and we will. But not with violence, not with guns and fists, with the truth. Garrett was quiet for a long time. The sun sank behind the western peaks and the valley below them filled with purple shadow. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the effort of restraining something darker. I am a man who solves problems with his hands, Clara. It is what the war made me, what this mountain made me. When someone threatens what is mine, every part of me wants to meet that threat with force. I know, but you are asking me to do it different. I am asking you to trust me, the way Thunder trusted me. His eyes found hers in the fading light, and she saw the war inside him, the soldier against the man, the instinct for violence against the desire to be better, to be the man that Clara saw when she looked at him rather than the man Ruth had seen. All right, he said finally, your way. But if he lays a hand on you, Clara, If he so much as looks at you wrong, I cannot promise anything. Fair enough. 2 days later, Earl Hargrove rode onto the property with 4 armed men. Clara heard the horses before she saw them. She was on her knees in the garden, and the sound of hooves on packed earth made her blood go cold before she even looked up. When she did, she saw 5 riders coming up the mountain road, and at the front, on a tall gray horse that looked as miserable as everything else Hargrove owned, sat a man who made the air around him feel poisonous. He was heavy and broad, with the kind of bulk that comes not from labor, but from excess. His face was wide and florid, his eyes small and calculating beneath the brim of an expensive hat. His mouth was the worst part of him. It curved in a permanent expression of contempt, as though the entire world existed for his amusement and displeasure. Clara knew that face. She had seen it in her nightmares since she was 7 years old. The man who had come to their farmhouse to collect debts that could never be repaid. The man whose voice had made her mother weep. The man who had smiled when he told her father that the horse he was selling him was a fine animal, well broken, gentle as a lamb. The horse that had killed William Whitfield 3 months later on a stretch of road just outside Elkhorn. Garrett emerged from the barn. His hand rested on the gun at his hip, not gripping, just touching, and his face was the face of the mountain itself, hard and immovable and ancient. Hargrove, you are on my land uninvited. Just being neighborly, Dawson. Hargrove's voice was smooth and oiled, the voice of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed. I hear you have been collecting my horses. Those horses were starved and beaten and abandoned. They stay here. See now, that is where you are wrong. Hargrove's smile was a terrible thing. Those horses are my legal property, and I want them back. No, the word landed between them like a stone dropped from a great height. Simple. Final. Absolute. Hargrove's small eyes narrowed. Then his gaze drifted from Garrett to Clara, still kneeling in the garden with dirt on her hands and cold fear in her veins. That your new girl heard you got yourself a pretty young thing. His tone made the words filthy, made them into something that crawled across Clara's skin. Be a real shame if something happened to her while you were out mending fences. Woman alone up here on a mountain. Dangerous country. What happened next occurred so fast that Clara barely tracked it. One instant, Garrett was standing by the barn 15 feet from Hargrove's horse. The next instant, he had crossed that distance and had Hargrove by the collar half dragged from his saddle, and the sound of fabric tearing was loud in the sudden silence. Threaten her again. Garrett's voice had dropped to something barely audible, and that quiet was more terrifying than any shout. Threaten her one more time, and I will bury you on this mountain where no one will ever find you. That is not a threat, Hargrove. That is a certainty. Hargrove's 4 men reached for their guns. But Dutch Samuel and Henry had materialized from various buildings around the ranch, all armed, all positioned, and all loyal. The standoff stretched across heartbeats that felt like hours. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Hargrove laughed. It was a cold sound, empty of humor, full of something rotten. You cannot protect her and your land and those horses all at once, Dawson. Something has to give. Garrett released him with a shove that sent Hargrove grabbing for his saddle horn. Get off my mountain. Hargrove straightened his collar. His eyes found Clara one more time, and the promise in them was so clear and so vile that she felt it like a physical blow. This is not over, he said. They rode away slowly, deliberately, leaving the threat behind them like a stain on the air. Clara's legs felt weak, but she walked to Garrett on steady feet. His hands were shaking, not with fear, but with the suppressed violence that coursed through his body like electricity. She took those trembling hands in hers and held them until they stilled. You cannot kill him, Garrett. If he threatens you again, I will. And then you will hang for it, and I will be alone again. She held his gaze with everything she had. I already lost my father because of that man. I will not lose you too. The fury in his eyes flickered. Beneath it, she saw something else. Terror, not of Hargrove, but of the possibility of leaving Clara alone in the world. Your way, he said roughly, but Clara, if he touches you, I am not making promises I cannot keep. Then we make sure it never comes to that. That night they made plans over dinner. Night watches, rifles within reach, a trip to the sheriff in town. But the plans felt thin against the size of the threat, like paper walls built against a coming storm. After the hands retired to their quarters, Garrett walked Clara to her cabin. They stood on the porch in the moonlight, and the mountain loomed above them, dark and ancient and indifferent to the small dramas of the people who lived in its shadow. Clara, he took her hands. Marry me. The words fell into the night like sparks from a fire. Clara's heart stopped, then raced, then stopped again. What, marry me? He said it again, more certain now, his eyes fierce and steady. I know it is fast. I know it is sudden. I know there are 100 reasons we ought to wait. But I also know that I do not want to spend another night pretending this is something it is not. I want you to be my wife, not for convenience, not for arrangement, for love, Clara. Because I love you. I have loved you since you knelt in the dust beside my horse and showed me what courage looks like. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, warm against the cold mountain air. Yes, she said. Yes. Yes, Garrett Dawson, I will marry you. Because I love you too. Because you are the first person who ever made me feel like I was enough. Like I was more than enough. He kissed her, then deeper than the first time, his arms wrapping around her and lifting her off her feet as though she weighed nothing at all. And Clara kissed him back with everything she had never given anyone, everything she had been saving without knowing she was saving it, all the years of loneliness and longing and quiet hope pouring out of her and into him. I will make you happy, he said against her lips. I swear it on everything I have. You already do. The wedding took place 3 days later in the small church in Elkhorn, with Dutch and Samuel standing as witnesses, and Reverend Harlan presiding with a mixture of skepticism and warmth. The church was nearly empty, just the 5 of them, and the late afternoon light streaming through windows that needed cleaning. Do you, Garrett Dawson, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. No hesitation, no doubt. Just 2 words spoken with the absolute conviction of a man who had found the one thing worth believing in. And do you, Clara Whitfield, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Clara looked at Garrett, this mountain man with his scarred hands and his scarred heart, who had given her shelter when she had none, who had let her teach him to read, who spoke to his horse about her when he thought no one was listening. This man who trembled when he tried to touch her face because he was afraid his rough hands were not worthy of her skin. I do, she said, and the words tasted like freedom. The kiss he gave her when Reverend Harlan pronounced them married was thorough enough to make Dutch clear his throat and Samuel look at the ceiling. Mrs. Dawson, Garrett murmured against her lips, and the wonder in his voice was the most beautiful sound Clara had ever heard. Mr. Dawson, she replied, smiling so wide her cheeks ached. They rode back up the mountain as the stars began to appear. Clara tucked against Garrett's side in the wagon, both of them giddy with joy and promise, and the trembling awareness that their lives had just changed in ways they were only beginning to understand. The mountain road was dark and winding, but the stars were bright, and Garrett knew every turn by feel. And Clara felt so safe beside him that she could have closed her eyes and slept. But she did not want to sleep. She wanted to be awake for every moment of this night, this first night as his wife, this beginning of everything. They came around the last bend, and the ranch spread out before them in the starlight. The house was on fire. Flames poured from the windows of the main house, orange and savage, against the black sky, and the roar of the fire was the sound of everything Clara had built being consumed. The curtains she had sewn, the kitchen she had organized, the reading table where Garrett had learned his letters with her grandmother's books propped before him, the wild flowers in the jar, all of it burning. Garrett was off the wagon before it stopped rolling. "The horses!" he shouted. "We have to get the horses out." Clara grabbed the rifle from beneath the wagon seat and ran after him, her wedding dress catching on brush and stone. The barn was not yet burning, but sparks flew on the wind like malevolent stars, and the heat was already intense. Inside, the horses screamed. Garrett and the ranch hands worked in coordinated fury, throwing open stall doors, cutting ropes, dragging panicked animals through the smoke by sheer force. Clara helped guide them to safety, her voice cutting through the chaos with that same calm steadiness that had soothed Thunder on the day they met. Thunder was the last one out. The stallion's eyes were white-rimmed with terror, and he reared and kicked at the smoke. But when Garrett's voice reached him through the roar, low and steady and commanding, the horse followed. Because trust once given by an animal like Thunder was not revoked by fire or fear. By the time the flames burned themselves out, the main house was gone, a skeleton of blackened timbers and scattered ash where a home had stood that morning. Clara looked at the ruins and felt something shift inside her. Not despair, fury, a white-hot and righteous fury that burned brighter than anything Hargrove's fire had produced. Because there at the edge of the property, just visible in the dying light of the flames, stood a figure on horseback, watching. Earl Hargrove had come to witness his handiwork. He did this, Clara said, and her voice did not shake. On our wedding night. He burned our home on our wedding night. Garrett's face was carved from stone, his eyes reflecting the last of the flames. I am going to end this. Not tonight. Clara gripped his arm with both hands. Tonight we make sure everyone is safe. Everyone is alive. Tomorrow we plan. Tomorrow we fight. But tonight we survive. He looked at her, saw the steel in her, and nodded. They spent the night in the barn, all of them together. Garrett, Clara, Dutch, Samuel Henry, and every horse on the property. It was cramped and smelled of smoke and fear. But they were alive, and they were together, and that was enough. Clara lay in Garrett's arms on a bed of clean straw. Her wedding dress ruined her face, streaked with soot, and she had never been more certain of anything in her life. I am sorry, Garrett whispered into her hair. This is my fault. I should have anticipated this. Should have posted guards. This is Hargrove's fault, not yours, and we are going to stop him. How? By being smarter, braver, together. She pressed closer to him, drawing strength from his warmth. And Garrett, there is something else. Something I have not told you yet. He stiffened slightly, his arms tightening around her. What? The truth about my father's death. I believe Hargrove did not just profit from it. I believe he planned it. Sold my father that wild horse knowing exactly what would happen. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quiet and hard as iron. I want to prove it. I want the world to know what he did. Not just to our ranch. To my family. To my father. Garrett was silent for a long time. The barn creaked around them. The horses shifted in their stalls. Somewhere outside, the ruins of their house popped and settled as the last embers cooled. Then we prove it, he said finally. Whatever it takes, we find the truth and we make it impossible for anyone to look away. Clara pressed her lips to his jaw, tasting smoke and salt. Thank you. You do not have to thank me for fighting beside you, Clara Dawson. That is what husbands do. Clara Dawson. The name settled over her like a warm blanket, like armor, like a promise. She closed her eyes and let the exhaustion of the worst and best day of her life pull her under, safe in the arms of the man who had married her under stars and held her through fire. Tomorrow would bring the fight. But tonight they had each other, and that Clara knew with bone-deep certainty was more than enough. The next morning brought a visitor that neither of them expected. They were sitting outside the barn in the thin early light, drinking coffee that Dutch had managed to brew on a camp stove, salvaged from the wreckage, when a figure appeared at the edge of the tree line. Small, female, moving with the hesitant, darting gait of a creature that expected to be struck. Lily Ashford was barely 20, though she looked younger. Her face was thin, her eyes enormous and haunted, and her hands twisted in the fabric of her apron with a restless anxiety that spoke of long habit. She stopped 20 feet from where Clara and Garrett sat and seemed unable to come closer, as though an invisible wall stood between her and them. I heard about what you did, she said, and her voice trembled like a wire in the wind. Standing up to Mr. Hargrove, taking in his horses. I heard about the fire, too. Clara set down her coffee and rose slowly the way she approached frightened animals. What is your name, dear? Lily Ashford. I worked for Mr. Hargrove, at his house, cleaning and cooking and such. Her hands twisted harder. He is not just cruel to animals. The words hung in the morning air. Clara did not need them explained. She had seen that particular shade of fear before in the eyes of women who came to her grandmother for help. Women with bruises they could not explain and silences they could not break. Come inside, Clara said gently. Let me make you some tea. Over the next hour, in the relative warmth of the barn that was serving as their temporary home, Lily told her story. How Hargrove had hired her after her father's death, the only work available to a girl with no family and no prospects. How it had started with comments that made her skin crawl, then escalated to threats, then to something darker that she described only in fragments, her voice breaking apart and reassembling like ice on a river in spring. She had been too afraid to tell anyone. Hargrove owned the general store, the bank, the feed supply. He held debts over half the families in Elkhorn. Who would believe a penniless girl against the richest man in the territory? But then I saw you, Lily said, looking at Clara with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. At the church social last month when you first came to town, and I heard people talking about how you were working for Mr. Dawson up on the mountain and how you had stood right up to Hargrove when he came to make trouble. And I thought maybe if you could be that brave, maybe I could too. Clara took the girl's hands in hers. They were ice cold and shaking. You are safe now, Lily. You never have to go back to that man. But there is something else. Lily's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Something I heard. One night late when Mr. Hargrove thought I had gone to bed, he was talking to his lawyer in the study about a man named William, about a horse, a wild horse that he had sold to someone on purpose knowing it would. She stopped, swallowed. He was laughing about it. The barn went very quiet. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. She felt 15 years of suspicion and grief and unspoken accusation crystallize into a single sharp, undeniable point. William, her father, the wild horse, sold deliberately, and Hargrove had laughed. Clara, Garrett's hand was on her shoulder, warm and solid, an anchor in a world that had suddenly lost all its gravity. Clara breathed, but Clara could not breathe. The sound that came out of her was not a sob, it was something deeper and more primal. The sound of a wound that had been carried for 15 years finally being opened and cleaned. She wept the way she had not wept since she was a child, since the day they put her father in the ground and her mother stopped speaking, and her grandmother held her through the night and whispered that some griefs were too big for little girls, but that little girls grew up to be strong women who carried their griefs like armor. Garrett pulled her against his chest and held her while she shook. He did not try to stop her tears. He did not offer empty comfort. He simply held her, this enormous man with his scarred hands and his steady heart, and let her grieve. When the storm passed, Clara pulled back and wiped her face with hands that no longer trembled. The tears had burned something away. What was left underneath was steel. He killed my father, she said, and her voice was clear. And now we can prove it. She turned to Lily, who was watching her with wide, frightened eyes. Will you stay with us? You can work here. You will be safe. Garrett will make sure of it. Garrett nodded once his face set. You have my word, Lily. No one will touch you. The girl looked from Clara to Garrett and back again, and something shifted in her haunted eyes. Not hope, not yet, but the first faint suggestion of it, like the first pale line of light before dawn. I will stay, Lily whispered, and I will tell the truth about all of it. Clara took the girl's hand and squeezed it. Two women, both damaged by the same man, both finding their strength not in spite of their pain, but because of it. Outside the barn, thunder nickered softly as if in approval. The morning sun climbed higher over the Montana mountains, burning away the last of the night's shadows. The fight was not over. It was just beginning. The weeks that followed the fire were the hardest Clara Dawson had ever lived through, and she had lived through plenty. They slept in the barn for the first 3 nights, all of them together. Humans and horses sharing the same space in a kind of primitive communion that reminded Clara of stories her grandmother had told about the earliest settlers, people who had nothing but each other, and the animals they depended on, and the stubborn refusal to let the land or the weather or the cruelty of other men drive them under. On the 4th day, Garrett and the Hands erected a temporary shelter from salvaged timber and canvas, something between a tent and a cabin with a proper stovepipe poking through the roof and enough room for Clara and Garrett to sleep without their feet hanging out the door. It was not much, but Clara had learned long ago that the size of a dwelling matters far less than the size of the heart that fills it. Garrett threw himself into the work of rebuilding with the same ferocious energy he had brought to building the original ranch. He was up before dawn and working until the stars appeared, felling timber, hauling stone, measuring and cutting and fitting with a precision that bordered on obsession. Clara understood what he was doing. He was not just building a house, he was building a fortress, a declaration, A message to Hargrove and to the world that said, "You burned what I built, and I will build it again bigger and stronger, and you will never burn it again." But even as the walls went up, the shadow of the coming trial grew longer. Sheriff Cooper had taken their statements, had documented the condition of the rescued horses, had filed charges for arson and destruction of property and animal cruelty. The circuit judge would arrive in 6 weeks to hear the case. 6 weeks of waiting. 6 weeks of looking over their shoulders and sleeping with rifles within reach and jumping at every unfamiliar sound on the mountain. The sabotage continued during those weeks, small and vicious and impossible to prove. Fences cut in the night. Gates left open so cattle wandered into ravines. Tools vanished from the new construction site only to appear days later in odd places as if moved by ghosts. Hargrove was too smart to leave evidence. He operated through intermediaries in darkness, a spider sitting at the center of a web that stretched across the entire valley. Clara slept lightly now, one hand always near the rifle that Garrett had given her, a Winchester repeater that he had taught her to load and fire and clean until the motions were as natural as breathing. She hated that she needed it, hated the fear that crawled into bed with her each night, hated the way Hargrove had taken the joy of her new marriage and threaded it through with anxiety and dread. "I hate this," she confessed one night, lying in Garrett's arms, in their temporary shelter, while the wind pressed against the canvas walls. "Feeling afraid in our own home. It will not be forever." His hands stroked her hair, slow and rhythmic, the same motion he used to calm thunder. 6 weeks until the trial. Once he is convicted, he will be in prison. And if he is not convicted— Garrett was quiet for a long moment. The wind filled the silence between them. "Then we deal with it together," he said finally, "the way we deal with everything." But Clara could hear the worry beneath his steady words, could feel the tension in the arm that held her, and she knew that Garrett Dawson was just as afraid as she was. Not for himself, for her. And that knowledge made her love him more fiercely than ever, because his fear was not weakness, but proof of how much she meant to him. 3 mornings later, Clara walked out to the pasture at dawn and found the bay mare dead. The mare was one of the 3 horses they had rescued from Hargrove, the first ones that had appeared at the fence line. She had been healing beautifully under Clara's care, gaining weight, losing the fearful look in her eyes, beginning to trust human hands again. Clara had named her Penny for the copper sheen of her coat in sunlight, and had spent hours with her each day, brushing and feeding and murmuring the same gentle words she used with Thunder. Now Penny lay on her side in the grass, her body stiff, her eyes glassy and open to a sky she could no longer see. Foam crusted her muzzle. Her legs were extended as if she had been running in her final moments, trying to outpace the poison that was killing her from the inside. Clara knelt beside the horse and placed her hand on Penny's cold neck. The fur was still soft. The muscles beneath it were hard with the rigor of death. This animal who had survived starvation and beatings and abandonment, who had finally found safety and kindness, had been murdered in the night by a man who could not tolerate the existence of anything he could not control. Clara did not scream. She did not cry. She knelt in the wet grass beside the dead mare and felt something inside her shift and lock into place, the way a rifle bolt slides home, the way a door closes for the final time. She had been afraid of Hargrove. She had been cautious, strategic, measured. She had counseled patience and legal process and the slow machinery of justice. But justice was too slow for Penny. Justice had not saved her father. Justice was a word that powerful men used to keep powerless people waiting, while the powerful men continued to do exactly as they pleased. Garrett found her there 20 minutes later. He took one look at the mare, one look at Clara's face, and his own expression became something that Clara had never seen on him before. It was beyond anger. It was the face of a man who had reached the absolute limit of what he could endure. He knelt beside her and pulled her against him, and Clara let herself be held, but she did not weep. The tears she discovered had been replaced by something harder and more useful. "This is the last animal he kills," she said, and her voice was a blade, quiet and sharp and absolutely certain. "The last one, Garrett. I know. I have a plan." He pulled back to look at her. In her brown eyes he saw something new. Not the gentle woman who whispered to horses, not the shy girl who had blushed at her first kiss. He saw a warrior. The granddaughter of a woman who had taught her that the measure of a person is how they treat those who cannot fight back, and Clara Whitfield Dawson was done measuring. She was ready to act. Tell me, Garrett said. We bury Penny today, and we do not do it quietly. We send word to every neighbor, every rancher, every family in this valley. We let them come and see what Hargrove's cruelty looks like. We let them stand over the body of a horse that was murdered for no reason other than spite. She stood brushing grass from her knees and looked down at Penny with eyes that burned. And then we bring every one of those rescued horses to the church social on Saturday. We let the whole territory see with their own eyes what Earl Hargrove does to living creatures. And we ask them, every single one of them, if this is the kind of man they want to keep protecting with their silence. Garrett rose beside her. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her the very first day when Thunder had pressed his nose into her palm. With wonder, with awe, with a dawning recognition that he was in the presence of something extraordinary. When did you get so fierce? He asked softly. I have always been fierce, Garrett. I just did not have anything worth fighting for until now. He pulled her close and pressed his lips to her forehead, and in that gesture was everything he could not say. Pride and love and the bone-deep certainty that he had married the right woman. Then let us fight, he said. The funeral for a horse might sound like a strange thing to those who have never loved an animal, but in a territory where horses were partners and companions, and the difference between survival and death, it was not strange at all. Word spread fast. Neighbors Clara had never met arrived on horseback and in wagons drawn by the story of the rescued horses and the burned house and the young widow-turned-mountain wife who had stood up to the most feared man in the valley. They stood around the grave that Garrett and his men had dug on the hillside overlooking the south pasture, and they looked at the wrapped form of the bay mare, and their faces told Clara everything she needed to know. They were angry. They had been afraid of Hargrove for years, most of them, afraid of his money, his influence, his willingness to destroy anyone who crossed him. But standing over the body of an innocent animal murdered by poison, something shifted in the collective heart of the community. Fear began to give way to shame, and shame began to give way to fury. The Reverend Harlan spoke a few words, simple words about stewardship and responsibility and the covenant between humans and the creatures God had placed in their care. Then Clara spoke, and her voice carried across the hillside, clear and strong as a bell. I know what it is like to feel powerless, to be at the mercy of someone stronger and meaner than you. This horse knew that feeling too. She survived it. She came through starvation and abuse and found her way to a place where people treated her with kindness. She was healing. She was learning to trust again. Clara paused and looked out at the gathered faces, weathered ranchers, tired farm wives, young men with hard hands and uncertain futures, all of them listening, all of them seeing themselves in her words. And then a man who could not stand the thought of a creature he had broken finding peace decided to kill her. Because that is what men like Earl Hargrove do. They cannot create anything, so they destroy everything. They cannot earn loyalty, so they demand obedience. They cannot love, so they make sure that nothing in their reach can be loved either. She felt Garrett's hand on her back, warm and steady, and she drew strength from it the way a tree draws strength from its roots. I am tired of being afraid of him, and I think you are too. The murmurs that followed were not the polite murmurs of a community going through motions. They were the low and gathering sound of people reaching a decision together the way a river sounds when it decides to change course. That Saturday, Clara and Garrett brought the rescued horses to the church. It was the largest gathering Elkhorn had seen in years. Half the territory turned out drawn by word of mouth and the electric charge of something important about to happen. Hargrove was there too, sitting in the front row with his expensive hat and his cold smile, confident that his money and his reputation would protect him the way they always had. His confidence lasted until Garrett led out the first horse. The animal was a gray gelding, one of the second group that had appeared on their land. He was healing, but the scars of his abuse were still vivid whip marks across his shoulders, saddle sores that had eaten through hide to raw flesh ribs that still showed despite weeks of proper feeding. Garrett led him slowly up the center aisle of the churchyard, and the crowd parted to let them through, and the gasps were audible. Women covered their mouths. Men swore under their breath. Children pressed against their parents' legs with wide, frightened eyes. This is what Earl Hargrove calls animal husbandry, Garrett said, and his voice carried the way it did on the mountain, clear and deep and impossible to ignore. This horse was starved, beaten, and abandoned. When my wife and I took him in to save his life, Hargrove threatened us. When we refused to give the horses back, he burned our house to the ground on our wedding night. That is a lie. Hargrove shouted from his seat, but his voice sounded thin against the evidence standing right there in front of everyone, evidence that could not be argued with or bought off or intimidated into silence. Garrett let out the second horse, then the third. Each animal told its own story through the map of scars on its body, and each story made the crowd angrier. By the time Clara stepped forward to speak, the mood in the churchyard had shifted from curiosity to something that crackled like heat lightning before a storm. I know what it is like to be hurt by someone stronger than you, Clara said, and her voice did not waver. My father, William Whitfield, was a farmer in this valley. 15 years ago, Earl Hargrove sold him a wild horse that had never been broken, knowing that the animal was dangerous, knowing what would happen. That horse killed my father on the Elkhorn Road. I was 7 years old. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to stop. I have a witness, Clara continued, who heard Hargrove laughing about my father's death in his own study, laughing about a man he had destroyed. The murmurs erupted. Hargrove was on his feet now, his face a mottled purple, shouting denials that no one was listening to. His expensive lawyer, imported from the city for the upcoming trial, was tugging at his arm, trying to get him to sit down and shut up, but Hargrove had lost the composure that was his most effective weapon. When the sheriff stepped forward with arrest papers citing destruction of property, animal cruelty, and complicity in the death of William Whitfield, the crowd did something that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. They cheered, not a polite golf clap of approval, a full-throated roar of relief and vindication, the sound of an entire community exhaling a breath it had been holding for years. Women wept, men slapped each other on the back. Dutch Callahan let out a whoop that startled 3 horses and sent a flock of birds wheeling up from the church steeple. Clara found herself in Garrett's arms, both of them laughing and crying at once, and in the chaos and noise and overwhelming emotion of the moment he said into her ear the 3 words that mattered most. You did it. We did it, she corrected, and kissed him right there in front of God and the whole territory, and she did not care one bit who saw. The trial convened 2 weeks later in the Elkhorn Church, the only building in town large enough to hold the crowd. The circuit judge, a lean and humorless man named Caldwell, who had a reputation for fairness and an allergy to nonsense, presided from a table set up where the pulpit usually stood. The irony of Hargrove facing judgment in a house of God was not lost on Clara. The prosecution called its witnesses one by one, and each testimony added another stone to the wall being built around Earl Hargrove. Ranchers who had seen him beat horses until they bled. Shopkeepers who had watched him bankrupt competitors through intimidation. Former employees who had quit rather than participate in his cruelty. The veterinarian who had examined the rescued horses and documented injuries that could only have been deliberately inflicted. Through it all, Hargrove sat at the defense table with his expensive lawyer and his expensive hat, in the rigid posture of a man who still believed his money could save him. But his eyes told a different story. They darted around the courtroom, calculating, searching for allies, finding none. Then it was Clara's turn. She walked to the witness chair on legs that trembled, acutely aware of every eye on her. The church was packed to the walls with people standing in the doorway and craning through windows. The weight of their attention pressed against her like a physical force. But when she sat down and looked out over the crowd, she found Garrett, front row. His gray-blue eyes locked on hers with a steadiness that said, I am here, I am not going anywhere, you can do this. For him, she could do anything. The prosecutor was gentle, leading her through her testimony with patience and clarity. How she had come to the Dawson Ranch. How she had found the injured horses bearing signs of deliberate abuse. How Hargrove had ridden onto the property and threatened her. How she had returned from her wedding to find her home in flames. Then the defense attorney rose for cross-examination, and the gentleness ended. He was a city man, sharp and polished with the predatory confidence of someone accustomed to dismantling witnesses the way a boy dismantles a clock piece by piece until nothing works anymore. Is it not true, Mrs. Dawson, that you were destitute when you arrived at the defendant's ranch, that you had been evicted from your lodgings and had no money, no family, and no prospects? Yes, Clara said simply, that is true. And is it not possible that a woman in such desperate circumstances might be inclined to fabricate stories to please her employer and secure her position. I did not fabricate anything. Those horses were real. Their injuries were real. The ashes of my house are real. But you are not a veterinarian, Mrs. Dawson. You have no formal training in animal medicine. How can you claim to know that the injuries were deliberately inflicted? Clara looked at the lawyer. She looked at him the way her grandmother had taught her to look at people who tried to make her feel small, with a calm directness that acknowledged his existence without granting it importance. Because I know the difference between an accident and cruelty, she said. The same way I know the difference between a man protecting his property and a man threatening violence against a woman. You learn to tell the difference quickly when your survival depends on it. The lawyer's eyes narrowed. Are you calling my client violent, Mrs. Dawson? I am calling him what the evidence shows he is, a man who hurts those weaker than himself because it makes him feel powerful. A man who sold my father a wild horse knowing it would kill him. A man who burns down houses and poisons animals and threatens women because he has never in his life faced a consequence for any of it. The courtroom erupted. Judge Caldwell brought down his gavel and called for order, but Clara was not finished. If we let men like Earl Hargrove get away with cruelty to animals, to women, to anyone who cannot fight back, then we are all complicit. Every one of us who stayed silent. Every one of us who looked the other way because we were afraid, or because it was easier, or because it was not our horse, not our house, not our family. It is all of our responsibility, every single one of us in this room. She saw heads nodding in the crowd. She saw women wiping tears. She saw men who had spent years bowing to Hargrove's power, straightening their spines and lifting their chins. And she saw Garrett looking at her with such fierce pride and love that her heart felt too large for the cage of her ribs. When Lily Ashford took the stand, the courtroom fell silent in a way that was different from the silence that had preceded it. This was the silence of people holding their breath, of a community preparing to hear something they would not be able to unhear. Lily was terrified. Her hands shook so badly that she clasped them in her lap to keep them still, and her voice was barely above a whisper. But she told her story, all of it, how Hargrove had hired her as a housekeeper, how his behavior had escalated from inappropriate comments to open threats to abuse of his power over a girl with no family and no resources and no one to turn to. How she had lived in daily terror for nearly 2 years, too afraid to speak because Hargrove owned the town and could destroy her with a word. And then she told them about the night she had overheard Hargrove and his lawyer in the study, about the name William, about the wild horse, about the laughter. He was proud of it, Lily said, and her voice cracked but did not break. He was proud that he had killed a man and gotten away with it. He said it was the smartest deal he ever made. Paid $12 for a horse he knew would kill and got 100 acres of land out of it. The sound that went through the courtroom was not a gasp. It was a groan. The collective sound of a community's conscience waking up after a long and cowardly sleep. Hargrove lunged to his feet, his face purple with rage, shouting that Lily was a liar, that she was making it up, that she was a worthless girl trying to destroy a respectable man. His lawyer grabbed his arm and tried to pull him down, but Hargrove shoved him away, and in that moment, with his mask torn off and his true face exposed to every person in the room, Earl Hargrove destroyed himself more completely than any testimony could have. The jury deliberated for 43 minutes. Guilty on all charges: animal cruelty, arson, destruction of property, intimidation and threats, complicity in the wrongful death of William Whitfield. The courtroom erupted in cheers that rattled the windows of the church. Clara was swept into Garrett's arms, and she buried her face in his neck and wept, not with grief this time, but with the overwhelming release of a burden she had carried since she was 7 years old. "It is over," Garrett said, his voice rough with emotion. "It is finally over." "Not quite," Clara whispered, because she could see Hargrove being led away in chains, and the look he shot them over his shoulder was pure and distilled venom. Even in defeat, there was menace in him. But almost. The sentencing came a week later, 12 years in the territorial prison. Hargrove would be an old man by the time he walked free, if he walked free at all. After the sentencing, as the community gathered on the steps of the church in the warm afternoon sun, Sheriff Cooper pulled Garrett aside. Clara watched them from a distance, saw the sheriff speak in low tones, saw Garrett's jaw tighten, and his eyes go hard. When Garrett returned to her, his expression was carefully neutral, but Clara knew him well enough now to read the tension beneath the surface. "What is it?" "Later," he said softly. "Tonight. Let today be a good day." She let it go because he was right. Today was a good day. Today justice had been served, and her father's ghost could rest, and the valley was free of the man who had terrorized it for decades. Today was for celebration, and celebrate they did. The whole community came to the Dawson Ranch that evening, bringing food and drink and music and the kind of unbridled joy that only comes after long suffering has finally ended. Dutch Callahan played the fiddle. Samuel Briggs danced with a widow from the next valley over and blushed crimson when she complimented his footwork. Henry Ward challenged everyone to an arm wrestling contest and lost cheerfully to a 13-year-old farm girl who was built like a young ox. Clara and Garrett danced under the stars. Not fancy dancing, just his arms around her waist and her head on his shoulder, and the slow turning of two people who had found each other against all odds. The music and the laughter and the flickering light of a bonfire washed over them, and Clara thought that if happiness had a feeling, this was it. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of love so strong that the pain became bearable, became small, became a memory rather than a wound. "Happy?" Garrett asked, his lips against her hair. Deliriously. "Think we can have a quiet life now?" "I hope so, though with you I am learning to expect the unexpected." He laughed, and the sound was rich and free and utterly unguarded, and Clara realized it was the first time she had ever heard him laugh without restraint, without holding something back, without the ever-present awareness of threats and sorrows and the heaviness of the life he had chosen. "I promise," he said, "no more drama, just you, me, the ranch, and whatever comes next." Later that night, after the guests had gone and the fire had burned low, Garrett told her what the sheriff had said. "Hargrove has a brother, Wade Hargrove, lives down in Wyoming. The sheriff says Earl sent him a letter before the arrest. Nobody knows what was in it." Clara absorbed this. She waited for the fear to come, the familiar cold clutch in her stomach. But it did not come. In its place was something else, something steady and resolute. "Then we will be ready," she said. "If and when anything comes of it, we will be ready." Garrett studied her face in the lamplight. "You are not afraid." "I have been afraid my whole life, Garrett, and I am done letting fear make my decisions. Whatever comes, we face it together, the same way we have faced everything else." Raw. He pulled her close and kissed her forehead, and she felt the last of the tension drain from his body. "Together," he agreed. "Always." The new house took shape through the golden weeks of early autumn, rising from the ashes of the old one like something from a story. But this house was different. This house was built by a community. Neighbors came from across the valley with lumber and stone and nails and expertise. The rancher from the next property over brought a team of draft horses to help drag logs. The blacksmith in Elkhorn forged hinges and hardware at cost. Women brought food for the workers, enough to feed an army, and the sound of hammering and sawing and laughter filled the mountain air from dawn to dusk. The house was larger than the original. Garrett insisted on that. A proper kitchen for Clara with a big window overlooking the valley so she could watch the sunrise while she cooked. A reading room with shelves that Garrett built himself from sanded pine shelves that would hold her grandmother's books and the new ones they would accumulate together. A stone fireplace large enough to heat the entire ground floor. A bedroom with a door that locked and windows that looked out at the stars. And one extra room. A small room just off the master bedroom with a window that faced east and caught the morning light. Clara discovered this room on the day the house was finished when Garrett walked her through it for the first time. He showed her the kitchen with nervous pride, the reading room with something close to bashful excitement, the bedroom with a tenderness that made her throat tight. And then he stopped in front of a closed door and rubbed the back of his neck the way he did when he was uncertain. "What is this room?" Clara asked, though something in her already knew. Garrett opened the door. The room was small and perfect, painted white with that east-facing window that flooded it with gentle light. There was nothing in it yet, just clean walls and a smooth floor and the scent of fresh timber and possibility. "It is for when we, if you want, someday." Garrett's ears turned red. This man who had faced down Hargrove and his armed men without flinching, who had run into a burning building to save horses who had survived a war and built a ranch from wilderness, could not finish a sentence about the possibility of having children with his wife. Children, Clara said softly. Someday, if you want. She stepped into the room and stood in the center of it in the warm morning light that poured through the window, and she placed her hand on her flat stomach and imagined what it would feel like to carry Garrett's child. To create a life with this man who had spent so many years believing he was not built for love. I want, she said, turning to him with tears on her lashes. I want everything with you, Garrett Dawson. He crossed the room in 3 strides and gathered her into his arms, and the kiss he gave her made her toes curl inside her boots, and her head go light, and her heart sing a note so high and pure that she thought the windows might shatter from the beauty of it. Then let us make that future happen, he murmured against her lips. That evening was their true wedding night. The fire crackled in the new stone fireplace. The quilt on the new bed was one that Clara had sewn herself during the weeks of rebuilding, stitched from scraps of fabric donated by women across the valley, each piece carrying its own story, its own warmth. Clara stood at the window in the soft light, looking out at the mountain and the stars, and Garrett came to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist, his chin resting on the top of her head. We have been married for 2 months now, he said, and his voice was low and warm with promise. I am aware, and I have been very patient. Clara smiled and turned in his arms, tilting her face up to look at him. I am aware of that too. I wanted you to be sure, wanted to do this right. You deserve to be courted proper even after the wedding. Garrett, she placed her palms flat against his chest, feeling the strong and steady drumbeat of his heart beneath her hands. I have been sure since the day your horse trusted me. I have been sure every day since. I will be sure tomorrow and the day after that and every day for the rest of my life. He kissed her then, not the careful, questioning kiss of their first time in the barn, not the desperate kiss outside the burning house. This was something new. Deep and unhurried and thorough, the kiss of a man who had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it. His hands moved to her hair, pulling the pins free so it fell around her shoulders, and Clara felt herself dissolving, becoming nothing but sensation, nothing but warmth, nothing but this man and this moment and the feeling of being cherished beyond anything she had ever imagined. I should tell you, she whispered against his neck, that I have no idea what I am doing. Neither do I, he said, and the honesty in his voice surprised her. Not like this, not with someone I love. This is new for me too. She pulled back to look at him, and what she saw in his eyes was not the confident mountain man or the battle-hardened soldier. It was a man as vulnerable and hopeful and terrified as she was, and that more than anything made her brave. Then we will figure it out together, she said. He lifted her into his arms as easily as if she were made of air and carried her to the bed, and Clara laughed against his shoulder, breathless and giddy and alive in a way she had never known was possible. Took you long enough, mountain man, she whispered. Had to be sure you were sure. I have never been more sure of anything. Then let me show you exactly how sure I am. What followed was tender and clumsy and achingly sweet. Garrett's hands trembled against her skin, not from cold, but from the enormity of what she was giving him. And Clara's breath caught not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that this was what it felt like to be truly known by another person, to be seen without reservation, to be held without conditions. He was gentle with her in a way that his size and roughness made surprising and wonderful. He whispered her name like a prayer. He asked if she was all right. He held her close when it mattered most and gave her space when she needed it, and looked at her throughout as though she were the most extraordinary thing he had ever encountered, more wondrous than mountains or sunsets or wild stallions touching a stranger's hand. Afterward, wrapped in each other under the quilt that a valley of women had helped Clara sew, both of them sated and peaceful and closer than two people had any right to be, Clara traced the scar on Garrett's eyebrow with her fingertip. How did you get this? She asked. Fight, years ago, defending a woman who was being harassed by a man twice her size outside a saloon in Bozeman. Of course you were. She kissed the scar. You have always been a protector. Only for those worth protecting. And am I worth it? He turned his face to catch her lips with his soft and slow and certain. You are worth everything, Clara Dawson. Everything and more. The news came on a Tuesday morning in early winter, announced not by words but by the sudden and violent rebellion of Clara's stomach against the smell of frying bacon. She made it to the outhouse just in time and spent the next hour alternating between misery and a joy so fierce it made her dizzy. When she returned to the kitchen, Garrett was hovering over the stove with the panicked expression of a man who has heard his wife retching and has no idea what to do about it. "Are you sick? I will ride down to town for the doctor." "You look pale. Sit down. Do not stand up. Should I make you tea? Is it the bacon? I will throw out the bacon." Garrett, "What? I am going to have a baby." The spatula he was holding hit the floor with a clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the silence that followed. For 3 full seconds, Garrett Dawson did not move, did not breathe, did not blink. He stood in his kitchen with bacon grease on his shirt and his mouth slightly open and his gray-blue eyes wide enough to reflect the entire morning sky. Then he was across the room, his arms around her, lifting her off her feet for the second time in their marriage. And the sound he made was not a word, but something more primal, a sound of pure and overwhelming emotion that seemed to come from the deepest part of him. "A baby," he said, setting her down gently, his hands moving to frame her face. "Our baby. Are you happy?" "Happy." He pulled back to look at her, and his eyes were wet. Garrett Dawson, mountain man, war veteran, horse whisperer, builder of ranches, and slayer of Clara's fears, was crying in his kitchen at 7 o'clock in the morning. "Clara, I am terrified and thrilled and grateful beyond anything I have words for. I cannot even breathe properly." Me too," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Exactly the same." He kissed her, then soft and reverent, and his hand moved to her still flat stomach with a tenderness that made her heart crack wide open. "When spring, I think. April or May. A spring baby." His smile could have lit the whole Montana territory, could have melted the snow on every peak from here to the horizon. "That is perfect. You are perfect. Everything about this is perfect. I am going to be sick a lot in the mornings. I will hold your hair. I am going to get very large. More of you to love. Garrett Dawson, if you become one of those hovering husbands who will not let his wife lift a finger for 9 months, I will murder you in your sleep." He grinned, unrepentant and radiant. "I make no promises." The pregnancy was difficult at first. Clara spent the first 3 months in a fog of exhaustion and nausea, barely able to keep food down, dragging herself through her daily tasks with a stubbornness that made Garrett simultaneously proud and anxious. He hovered. He could not help it. Every time she lifted something heavier than a dish towel, he materialized at her side like a guardian spirit in a flannel shirt and took it from her hands. "I am pregnant, not dying," Clara told him for the 100th time. "You are carrying my child, which means you are the most important thing on this mountain, and I will wrap you in cotton wool if I see fit." Garrett, Clara. They stared each other down across the kitchen table, and then Clara burst out laughing because the sight of this enormous mountain man pouting at her like a scolded child was too absurd and too wonderful to resist. He laughed too, and the sound filled the house the way it always did, now warm and rich and unguarded. He started cooking dinner. His early attempts were disastrous. Biscuits that could have been used as ammunition, gravy that resembled wallpaper paste, stew that tasted like boiled leather. But he persisted with the same fierce determination he brought to everything, and by the 3rd month he could produce a passable meal that would not poison anyone, though Clara still supervised from her chair by the fire, the special chair he had built for her with extra padding and a footrest. "You are spoiling me," she said one evening, watching him stir a pot that was for once not smoking. "That is the plan. I can still cook, you know." "I know, but let me take care of you, please." She softened, seeing the need in his eyes. This was not about control, it was about love, and about a man who had never had anyone to care for, and who had discovered in the miracle of his wife's pregnancy a purpose that fulfilled him in ways that building a ranch and taming a mountain never had. "All right," she said, "but I am supervising the biscuits, for the safety of all involved." Winter came hard to the mountain as it always did. Snow piled in drifts against the new house, and the temperature dropped until the air itself seemed to crystallize. Clara spent most days inside sewing baby clothes from fabric that Lily brought up from town, where the young woman had found work as a seamstress and was slowly, carefully building a life of her own. My mother taught me to sew, Lily said one afternoon, her needle flying through fabric with practiced grace. She said a woman with skills would always survive. Your mother was right, Clara replied, her own hands busy with a tiny bonnet. But survival is not the same as living. Watching you and Garrett, the way you are together, the way he looks at you and you look at him, that is living. That is what I want someday. Clara reached across and squeezed Lily's hand. You will have it when you are ready. In the evenings, Garrett read aloud to Clara while she sewed. He read well now, fluently and with expression, and the sound of his deep voice filling their home with stories was one of Clara's greatest pleasures. He read to the baby too, pressing his lips close to Clara's growing belly and narrating the adventures of heroes and explorers and brave women who crossed mountains and oceans to find their destinies. Do you think the baby can hear you? Clara asked, amused and touched. Does not matter. I want my child to know my voice from the very beginning. Want it to know it is loved before it even has a name. One evening in January, Clara took Garrett's hand and pressed it to her swollen belly. He felt the kick strong and sure against his palm, and his eyes went wide as saucers. That is our baby, he breathed, in there, moving. Where else would it be? I know. He shook his head, wonder written across every line of his face. We made a person, Clara, you and me. An actual human being. We did, and in a few months we will get to hold that person. Garrett pressed his forehead to her belly and whispered something too soft for Clara to hear, something between him and his child, and she placed her hand on the back of his head and felt her heart expand to a size she had not known it could reach. Sarah Dawson came into the world on a warm April afternoon, 3 weeks ahead of schedule, but with the unmistakable lung power of a child who intended to make herself heard. Clara labored for 12 hours. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, harder than walking 10 miles up a mountain in the heat, harder than standing in a courtroom and testifying against the man who had killed her father, harder than watching her home burn on her wedding night. But Garrett was there. He held her hand through every contraction, his grip steady, even when hers threatened to break his fingers. He wiped her face with cool cloths. He spoke to her in the same low, soothing voice he used with thunder, and that voice was her lifeline, her anchor, the rope she clung to when the pain threatened to pull her under. The midwife suggested repeatedly that Garrett might be more comfortable waiting outside. I am not going anywhere, he said each time in a tone that precluded further discussion. When the baby's cry finally pierced the air, thin and sharp and magnificently alive, Clara wept with a relief so profound it felt like a physical unburdening, as if every grief and fear and sorrow she had ever carried had been lifted from her shoulders in that single instant. A girl, the midwife announced, placing the tiny, squalling, perfect bundle in Clara's arms, healthy and strong. A girl, Garrett repeated, and his voice was a wreck, demolished by the force of what he was feeling. He looked down at his daughter with an expression that Clara would carry in her memory forever. Pure wonder, absolute surrender. The look of a man who has just discovered that the heart he thought was already full can expand beyond all known limits. The baby had Clara's delicate features and Garrett's dark hair. She opened her eyes gray-blue like her father's and seemed to look directly at them with the calm and knowing gaze of someone who has chosen exactly where she wants to be. Hello, little one, Clara whispered, tears streaming freely. We have been waiting for you. What should we name her? Garrett asked, his enormous finger stroking the baby's tiny hand with a gentleness that defied everything about his size and history. Clara had been thinking about this for months, had turned possibilities over in her mind during the long winter nights, weighing names like precious stones, testing them for weight and light and resonance. Sarah, she said, after your mother. Garrett's face did something that Clara had never seen it do before. It crumpled, simply fell apart, all the strength and stoicism and mountain hardness collapsing like a wall that has finally been breached by water. And what came through the gap was the rawest and most beautiful thing Clara had ever witnessed. My mother, he managed. She raised a good man, Garrett, a man who loves deeply and protects fiercely and learned to read at 36 because a woman he loved offered to teach him. I want our daughter to carry her name. I want Sarah to know that she comes from a line of people who are strong enough to love even when it is hard. Garrett wept, silently, freely, without shame or restraint, Mountain man soldier, rancher husband, and now father weeping in a sunlit room with his wife and daughter, and Clara had never loved him more than in that moment of complete and total vulnerability. Sarah Dawson, he said finally, testing the name, tasting it. Then he smiled through his tears, and it was the smile of a man who has been given more than he ever dared to ask for. It is perfect. She is perfect. You are perfect. We are a family, Clara said, looking at her husband and her daughter with a heart so full it ached. A real family. A real family, Garrett echoed, and leaned down to press his lips to his daughter's forehead with a tenderness that could have calmed a storm. 6 months later, Clara stood in the garden she had planted around the new house, her hand resting on a belly that was just beginning to round with their second child. The house was finished. The horses were thriving. Thunder grazed peacefully in the south pasture with a new foal at his side, a leggy little colt born to one of the rescued mares, a mare who had been pregnant when they saved her. Thunder had adopted the foal as his own standing guard over the young horse with a protective vigilance that made Clara smile every time she saw it. Sarah napped in a basket on the porch, her tiny fist curled under her chin, her dark hair already starting to curl the way Garrett's did when it was wet. She was a good baby, calm and curious, and equipped with a pair of lungs that could shatter glass when she was hungry. Clara heard his footsteps before she saw him. She always did now, attuned to his presence the way a compass needle is attuned to north. The rhythm of his walk, the weight of his boots on packed earth, the particular way the air shifted when he was near. There you are, Garrett said, wrapping his arms around her from behind, careful of the small bump between them. How are my three favorite people this afternoon? Sarah is sleeping. This one is making me tired already. She placed her hand over his where it rested on her belly. And I am standing in a garden that I planted around a house that we built on a mountain that tried very hard to defeat us and failed. Another girl you think, or a boy, whichever it is, they will be loved. Garrett pressed a kiss to the place where her neck met her shoulder. Just like their mother. Clara turned in his arms and tilted her face up to look at the man who had given her everything she had never known she needed. Home, safety, love, a family. A reason to believe that the world, for all its cruelty, was also capable of extraordinary grace. I never thought I would be this happy, she admitted. Neither did I. Thought I was destined to be alone up here forever. Good thing I am stubborn. Good thing my horse trusted you. They both looked at Thunder grazing in the golden light with his adopted foal prancing beside him. The stallion who had trusted no one. The stallion who had changed everything. Do you think he knows, Clara asked, that he brought us together? Probably. Animals know more than we give them credit for. The sun moved lower, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and rose, and the mountain cast its long shadow across the valley, and everything was quiet, and everything was warm, and everything was exactly as it should be. And then at the far end of the road that wound down the mountain toward Elkhorn, a figure on horseback appeared, a silhouette against the sunset, motionless, watching the ranch from a distance. Just watching. Then after a long moment, the figure turned and rode away, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Nobody in the ranch saw the rider, but Thunder saw. The stallion's head came up from his grazing. His ears swiveled forward, his nostrils flared, and his dark eyes fixed on the place where the rider had been with an intensity that spoke of instinct and warning, and something ancient and animal that human beings had long since forgotten how to hear. Thunder nickered. Not the soft nicker of contentment, a sharper sound. Alert, wary. Clara looked over. What is it, boy? See something. The stallion held his gaze on the empty road for a long moment. Then he snorted, shook his great head, and returned to his grazing. But his ears stayed pointed toward the road, listening, watching, always watching. Come inside, Garrett set his arm around Clara's waist. Getting cold. Clara took one last look at the garden, the house of the horses, the mountain that rose above them like a guardian. She breathed in the scent of pine and wood smoke, and the sweet, dusty smell of her daughter's hair, and the clean leather smell of the man she loved. I love you, she whispered. I love you too, Garrett replied. Today, tomorrow, every day after that, until there are no more days. Sarah stirred in her basket, making the small sounds that meant she would wake soon, hungry and demanding and perfect. Clara smiled and moved toward her daughter, and Garrett followed his hand, never leaving the small of her back, and together they walked into the house they had built on the mountain that had tried to break them and failed. Home, Clara thought. Home was not a place. It was this man, this land, this life they had fought for and earned and built together from nothing but stubbornness and love. It was the baby in the basket and the baby growing inside her. It was Thunder and his adopted foal, the rescued horses now thriving in green pastures, the ranch hands who had become family. It was Lily growing stronger every day in town, proving that survival was only the beginning and that living real living was something you chose every single morning. It was every sunrise they had faced together, every storm they had weathered, every kiss in the barn and every reading lesson by lamplight, and every meal shared across a kitchen table that had become the center of their universe. And it was finally beautifully, unshakably theirs. In the barn, thunder nickered one last time soft and low, and somewhere far below in the valley a coyote called to the rising moon. The mountain stood silent and ancient above them, all keeping its secrets, holding its ground, watching over the family that had carved a home from its stone and filled it with something stronger than any mountain. Love, the kind that lasts,